Hello and welcome to Quilt Addicts Anonymous. I'm Stephanie Soebbing. We recently celebrated the first anniversary of our opening of our brick and mortar location in Rock Island, Illinois. And to celebrate, we had a big event where we had people from our local customers come and check out free demos all day long. And we had lots of requests from you guys to film those, so we did. This demo is all about sewing triangles. I did in less than half an hour, 4 different types of triangles, all from squares. We called it Triangle Boot Camp. So it's a lot of fun. I go over some ways to have some really accurate points and how to do it and the math you need to do if you're going to be converting a pattern that does triangles a different way. So you can watch this. It's not the same quality as you've come to expect from the videos you see that I film here in my home sewing studio, because we film them all live with people looking on, so there was no time to stop and adjust lighting and angles and all that fun stuff. But it's still fun, and a lot of great tips and tricks are in them, so check it out. So we're making all the triangles in the quilt behind me over here. That was one of the first patterns I ever designed, and it includes 4 different types of triangles, all made from squares. And I really like making triangles from squares because I feel like they always turn out a lot better than if you cut them apart first and then sew on the bias, because with everything still together, they basically have less stretching when you're sewing it together, and you're more likely to be happy with the end results. Also with the flying geese, there is 0 waste, so that's always helpful, especially if you're someone who likes to use every single last bit of fabric. So tip number 1 is to set your sewing machine to a scant 1/4 inch seam if you're able to do that. With me, all I have to do is hit a button and my sewing needle moves 1 needle width to the right. And that just gives me a little bit extra wiggle room, so that way I am less likely to have something be just a hair bit too small. If you do not have a sewing machine that does that, instead of having your fabric even with the line that we're going to draw here, you just want to have it be like maybe on top of instead of just to the side. So we're going to start with the half square triangle. So that is this little guy here. So the proper measurement is an extra 7/8 of an inch larger than whatever your finished size is. With mine, I always add a full inch because I would rather waste an 1/8 of an inch of fabric than have something be too small. So we're going to start, we're going to have 4 inch finished here. So I have 2 5-inch squares, and I drew a line from point to point on the wrong side of one of those. So I'm going to lay those right sides together. If you are a pinner, I am not, so I normally would not pin if I was doing this. We are going to want to pin across the line at the top and across the line at the bottom. It does you no good whatsoever to pin out here because these are the points that need to be lined up. So pin where it matters, and in this case, it's going to be right there. So what we're going to do is we're going to pretend that this line is the edge of our fabric. So normally we sew with the edge of our fabric, even with the edge of our presser foot. In this case, we are going to put the edge of our presser foot even with that line. And I'm going to sew down both sides of it. Now, if you were doing a bunch of these for a quilt, you can chain piece them. But we're going through 4 different types of triangles in 45 minutes or less. So there is going to be no chain piecing today. So now I can turn this around, line it up again so that the edge of my presser foot is even with that line, and sew down this side. So now I've got 1/4 inch seams, scant 1/4 inch seams on either side of that drawn line. And so now I can cut it apart. And it doesn't matter if you are exactly on top of that drawn line, but you don't want to get too skinny. Like I've seen seams on these that are like so skinny they're going to pop open on the long arm. So you don't want it to be any skinnier than about 1/8 of an inch, but if you haven't cut exactly on that drawn line, that's okay, because you already have your accuracy from when you sewed it, so you don't have to worry too much about it when you're cutting it apart. Again, as long as it's not too skinny. So now I can set my seam And the biggest thing people make when they do this is they don't set their seam and they don't sort of finger press this open. So what you want to do is have your iron completely on the side that you are pressing away from, and then just drag it up. And you want to treat this with respect because it is a bias seam. It can get all out of whack. If you're doing this and you find you have like little smileys where they're coming up on the edge, that probably means that you didn't maintain your 1/4 inch seam all the way to the point. So work on doing that a little bit more. But what you don't want to do is do this and then just plop your iron down, because you might get a pleat. You might get a seam, one going one way and the other corner going the other. So you want to make sure that you are gently dragging that iron up rather than plopping it down. So now we got to trim this up, and trimming is so key. In this case, we started off a little bigger than we needed to be, but we want to get rid of all of those edges, the dog ears as well, because it'll make for a much flatter quilt when everything's said and done. So when I trim, I put my 45-degree line going even with this seam, and I want it going all the way from the tip to the bottom, because if this is not even with your edge, if your 45-degree line isn't going all the way to the edge, then your corner is never going to be in your corner, and it doesn't matter what you do sewing-wise, you've already cut it off. And then I'm making sure that I've got a little bit of fabric hanging off beyond the 4.5 inch line, because we need an extra 1/2 inch for our seam allowance, and then outside the ruler on this side as well. So once I've decided all that's good, I'm going to cut on the right side and the top. I'm going to flip it around. And this time, since we just cut that edge and we did a 180-degree flip, now I can put 4.5 exactly on the edge that I just cut because it's already trimmed. I still have my 45-degree line going all the way through to the edge from point to point, and then I can trim again. So if you're doing this and your points are not going directly to the point, then you are never going to have points end up in the corner where they're supposed to on the block. Go ahead and pass that around. And pass this one around too with it, because you can see the difference between the two and the importance of trimming. Okay, so next up, we are going to do an hourglass unit. So it starts off the same way, just we're starting with a bigger triangle. So instead of 5-inch triangles, I have 5 1/4 because we need a little bit extra fabric. So I'm going to go ahead and lay those right sides together, just like we did before. I'm going to skip pinning on this one. And I'm going to sew this again with a scant 1/4 inch seam down both sides. And one thing I do to help prevent those little smileys when we're not maintaining a 1/4 inch seam is I keep my finger just to the right of that presser foot all the way through. Like, I will not lift this finger up until all of my block has gone through. So now when I turn this around, I know that I've sewn a true 1/4 inch seam all the way down. Because it's kind of hard to keep it going straight when you get to the end if you're not guiding it. All right. So now it starts out the same way, where we're going to cut this apart, and I'm going to press it. But I'm not going to trim until I get to the very end, because I don't want to accidentally trim off too much and then not have enough at the end. So I'm going to go ahead, I'm going to press both of these underneath my neutral in this case, because I'm going to nest my seams. So I'll show you what I mean by that in a second. Okay, so now I need to draw a line on the wrong side of these. Grab my pen. Do not use an ink pen for this. That can get all over your fabric when you're working on it. So something that's made for fabric is great, like this friction gel pen, or a pencil's fine too. So I'm lining up from point to point with the ruler going across that seam. And I'm gonna draw from the center out. I always have trouble if I try to go all the way across when it's on the seam, so I always just go from the center out on that. So I've got my line drawn, and then I wanna flip these so that my neutral is against my print. And I wanna line this up so that my points are even, and I wanna feel this come together. I'm gonna have all you come around and feel it. But one really great way to check is if you open this up, if you put your finger right where that line is and open it up, your points should be coming together perfectly in the center. If they're not, then they're not gonna come together perfectly when you put them together. But what you can do is you can put a little pin in, and I would pin across the seam if I were doing this, but I'm gonna put a pin in and have you guys come and feel how this is, because you want to feel a nice solid piece. You want to feel it like move solidly across. Feel on the seam. You do not want to feel a bump, and you do not want to feel a gap. If you feel a bump, it means that your seams are on top of each other. If you feel a gap, it means that they're too far away. You want to feel right there. Right here doesn't matter. Right there is where it matters. Yep. So again, it does not help you if you pin over here, because that's not where you're sewing. You got to pin where you're going to sew. So now I'm going to line up my points here. And we're going to sew down both sides again. And again, you can chain piece these if you want. I got my points relined up again at the back. We'll go down the other side. Now, if this is the first time you've ever done this, before you cut it apart, you should open it up and make sure that your points came together properly, which they did. Now, if you've, because I've definitely taught this and it hasn't for people. So we want to make sure before we cut it and do something we can't undo, make sure you're happy with the way that it looks before you do that. Okay, so now I can cut this apart. And again, same deal. It doesn't matter if you are perfectly on the line that you drew, but you do not want your seam to be any smaller than 1/8 of an inch, or it is going to pop open if you have it long-armed, or even just with regular wear and tear and washing, it can pop open if your seam gets too skinny. So now I can press this, and I'm just going to press, well, I guess I'll press both. We're doing good on time. Press that open. Now with this one, when we trim, we got a couple extra things to pay attention to because we have points on all 4 corners instead of just 2. So we'll move that. So in this one, I'm going to flip it around. And actually this one came out a little smaller than 4.5, which is okay as long as you are about less than 1/8 of an inch off. You can fudge it when you're putting it together and it's fine. And see, sometimes it's weird. Sometimes they'll come out, one will be bigger than another. So we'll see if this one is at 4.5.
Can you cut those out just an inch bigger than what?
1.25 inches bigger than your finished size. Yep.
For this one.
For this one.
A half square,
it was 1 inch.
That's what I thought.
So this one, I've got my 45-degree line going down the center. And then, just like we did for the other one, and then I'm also making sure that where this point comes out, that it comes out right at 4.5 here and down here. So this one, I've got to actually give it a little bit of a tug with my fingernail to get that point truly in the corner. And that's okay to do that. It's a bias, which means that when we're putting it together, we can also manipulate it a little bit to make it work. So I didn't get too much off of that one because the math is really close. If you find that you're having a really hard time getting everything to come out the right size, just make them a little bigger and trim them down. And there's nothing wrong with that. If you can't do it at 1.25 inch bigger, then cut them all 1.5 inches bigger. And that's fine. It's not a big deal. Do what makes it work for you. Just make sure you buy an extra fabric if you're doing it with a pattern.
That's what I was just going to say. If you've got a pattern and they're giving you yardage, a lot of times you have extra, and then I found that you're so tight, even doing it the regular way.
Yeah, so just get extra.
Some of them are generous and some of them are not.
So now, same deal, we flipped it over, so I've got 4.5 exactly even with 4.5 here. I've got the diagonal still coming, and then I have my points coming out to the edges right at 4.5. So now I can trim this. And now I have all of my points going right to the edges of all of my triangles. So I'm going to have perfect pieces going forward, which is great. Okay. Now we're going to combine the two. And we're going to do a double pinwheel. So that's what we do with these, and you get mirror image blocks. So if you want, in this pattern it uses all of them. Some patterns you only need it like to be this way, where you have your little one on the bottom. So this may not work for every pattern that you do. You may end up with a bunch of bonus ones to do something else with, but you can see how that goes. Okay, so to start off with, I need 2 5 1/4 because we're going to start off making this part first. So that's the part that we're breaking down into quarter square triangles. So I'm going to line that up again with my right sides together. You could pin here and here if you want to. Now I'm going to sew my scant 1/4 inch seam down both sides. Cut it apart just like all the others. Just going to do one of these for right now, but you could get quite a few out of this if you wanted to. Okay, so now this should measure 4 7/8 inches square. We're going to pair it with one that's 5 inches because I cut them all at the same time, and I like having a little extra. So this is going to be just a little bit smaller than the one that's behind it. If you wanted your math to be exact, you could cut a 4 7/8 inch square, but I hate cutting 1/8 of an inch if I don't have to, so I always go with a full inch larger on those. So now I'm going to take this, and again I'm going to draw that line on the wrong side from point to point, crossing that seam line. Now in this one, we do not have to worry at all about matching anything up in the center because that's just a plain block. So you don't have to worry about pinning, you just need to make sure that this is nice and centered in your block. So now we're going to sew down both sides. These things are great when you're doing these, by the way.
You sell those here?
We used to, but everybody just uses a 50% off coupon and gets them at Joann's, so you can do that if you want. So now I can cut that apart. And then when I press it, I'm going to get mirror image blocks.
So you can see that when the triangles are in the same position, your quarter square triangle changes. So if you have a pattern where they all are supposed to be on one side, then this might not work for you unless you want to have a bunch of bonus blocks to do something with. But in this pattern, we use both of them because I want you guys to be able to use everything that we use. So when we trim this down, it's not that different than anything we've been doing before. So I'm going to line it up, still with that 45-degree line going through, and I want to make sure that there's some hanging off all the sides. And I want to make sure that this point coming down is coming right out at the 4.5-inch mark. So that way that point will be right at the corner where it's supposed to be. I'm going to go ahead and flip that, do our 180-degree flip. Now I'm going to line the edge up exactly with 4.5. And this is still coming to the corner, so that's good. And now we're perfect. Actually, it's a little off, but it'll be fine. So that's that. So now this is the really fun one. This is called a couple of different things. It's called no waste flying geese. It's also called 4 at a time flying geese units. You all kind of get the same thing. So this comes together in a couple of different ways. I've already pre-marked my lines on this one. And I'm going to pin these for you guys so you can see how to do it with pins. I don't pin. I'll just have like a stack of these ready to go. So I've got a 5.25-inch piece. This is also going to finish 2x4. So it would fit in with everything else that we're doing. So this is 5.25 is my big square, and 2 7/8 is my little square. So you cannot, unfortunately. I have tried, and it doesn't work. I know. Trust me, I've tried. Because this is the one that people have the hardest time with, making it like work. So the math is right on for this one. Okay, so I've got those pinned. Basically, you want to make sure that your top corners are in line. If this line doesn't line up perfectly, not the end of the world. Don't worry about it. So, same deal. First, reinstall your presser foot. There we go. It's been through a lot today. So don't sew your pins ever. I have broken a pin and had it fly at my eye, and thankfully the needle was still like in the thread. So it didn't make it all the way there, but it was scary. So don't do that. This is also something you can chain piece if you have a whole bunch of them to do. All right, so now, somebody's very popular today. We're gonna cut that down the center, and now is the point where everybody always looks at me and says, Stephanie, this is not going to be a flying geese, because it looks like a heart when we press this open. So I'm gonna go ahead.
That big square fabric?
This is Amy Butler.
I like that.
We have it on yardage. Part of the night music line. So if it looks like a heart, you're on the right track. You're doing okay. It may not look like it, but you're going to be just fine. Okay, so now I've got my other two, and those need to go right in the corner, and you're going, let me pin it before I lift it up. My line is going away because it's too hot. I can see where it was. It's all right. So when I'm sewing this, your 1/4 inch should be right where these little valleys are when you're sewing it. And I'll pass it around before I cut it apart so you guys can see. But that's how it should work. should just come, you should sew right down here, and your needle should go straight through on one side and then straight through on the other when you're going down. All right, so my needle went straight through that valley, exactly where it should be. We'll do this side here. And I was told that I probably shouldn't share this story, but I'm going to. So we are doing this as part of our intermediate class, and I'm remaking the quilt because the thread bled on that one and gives it a pink tinge. And I waited till the last minute, like everybody, to redo it. And I was sewing with friends, and I made every single triangle that I need for this one, except for like the couple that I made in class as demonstrations, within one afternoon and evening sewing with friends, and that was with a dinner break. And so this can be really fast if you like know what you're doing, because it can go, once you get the hang of it, that's the key part. And it can really speed up everything because you're not having to cut everything ahead of time. I find it so much faster if you can sew it together first and then trim it. And that's why strip piecing is great, and then cutting things off that way. Okay, so here's where the magic is going to happen. I'm going to cut these apart, and we're going to get 4 flying geese out of that. Oh, let me pass this one around so you guys can see. That thread is coming out right on where that seam allowance is, or where that little valley is. It's been a long day. My words are not making sense anymore.
How it comes out.
All right. So now I'm pressing these guys open, and these would look the same way once they're cut apart. As we now have, it would be 4 flying geese with that. So that works out pretty slick. Show you guys how to trim these. And this is really important to trim because they get a little weird. Like this one is like super weird. So I'll trim with the really weird one so you guys can see how to do it, because sometimes this happens. All right, so what you want to do is line it up so that where your 4.5 and your 2.5 is in this bottom corner. And then also same over here, 2.5 should be at the bottom corner here. Now this one, it got a little in a little. Now in theory, this point should be a 1/4 inch away from the edge. It isn't always in practice, and that's okay. You can kind of fudge it a little bit when you put it together. But I'm gonna go ahead and trim it. Usually I always have one that's a little off when I do these. So of course it happens on camera for y'all. So now when I flip it over, this obviously doesn't go all the way out to 2.5, but that's okay. It's gonna be in the seam allowance. No one is ever gonna know that that happened. So I've got my 45-degree line now going out to the corner, and I still have the corner over here is meeting right at the edge of the ruler at 4.5 inch. So I can trim it, and it's looking better. It's still not fabulous, but this one will do so you can see what it looks like on a good one. And it's always like 1/2 is perfect, and the other half you're like, how did this come from the same set? I just don't understand. But, so this one I've got, you know, this is all where it should be. 4.5 and 2.5 are at my point. 2.5 is right at the edge of the mark, or edge of the ruler where this is. And in this case, 2 1/4 is right at 1/4 inch, which is exactly where it should be if that's going to be in the center of your block. If it isn't, don't stress out about it, because you can always kind of cheat that a little bit later. So now I'm going to flip it over, measure this guy. So now we've got my 45-degree line is still going in here. Everything else is nice and lined up. And my points are where they should be. So right at the 4.5 inch where it meets the edge, and going along that 45-degree line. And now, as a bonus, I'm going to show you guys how to make it look like this never happened. So, when I'm sewing these, I'm going to sew these right sides together, and I'm going to sew it always with this point up. So when we look at this, there is an X that is formed with our thread. And I kind of highlight that with purple so you guys can see it. So you see that X? We want to be just one needle width on the seam side of that X so that we don't ever lose a point when we're sewing it together. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to lay these guys right sides together, and this may be in a little bit further than a standard 1/4 inch seam. And if that's the case, I'm going to slowly kind of curve out a little bit with my sewing needle, so that way I'm one needle width to the right of that, and then I'm going to slowly make it back to my regular 1/4 inch stitch. Because no one is ever going to notice if you were off a little bit in your 1/4 inch stitch, but they're sure going to notice if your point isn't where it should be. So I'm going to move my needle position back to my regular 1/4 inch seam. And I'm going to start off. My points are nice and together where it starts. And then I'm just going to kind of put my finger on top of this one down here to kind of keep my corners together on the other side. So I'm going to start sewing. I'm about midway through that block. I'm kind of evaluating where I need to be in order to have that needle be just one needle width to the right of that X. And I do need to come in just a little bit, so I'm coming in just a smidge, not too much. So now I'm going to come back out and get back to my 1/4 inch. And so it's more obvious on the back here. You can tell that I came in some on this side and then came back out. But once I press this, you're never going to know that that happened. So now I can press that, set my seam, press this open, and all you see is the point that is exactly where it's supposed to be.
Thank you so much for watching this tutorial from our demo day at our first anniversary sale. It was great to be able to celebrate with everyone, and especially to have, 1 year in the books at a time when a lot of quilt shops are closing. So we're really fortunate to be able to make this happen. And it also includes, we had to thank you guys because we do a lot of sales online. It is not just our local customers that keep us going. It is all the people who purchase from shop.quiltaddictsanonymous.com, and we ship to them all over the world, really. We've got customers everywhere that we're shipping to. So thank you for being part of that. And also our wholesale patterns that are available at quilt shops across the US and Canada. So when you see the Quilt Addicts Anonymous logo, know that you are helping to support a small family business, even if it may not be local to you. So thank you very much for that. We're very appreciative of all of your support and watching our video tutorials and making our patterns and checking out our blog. We love you all for it. Thanks so much, and until next time, happy quilting.